Noblesse Oblige Legacy of the Sorcerer Kings is not only a mouthful, it's a free epic fantasy RPG maker game created by solo developer Lord Forte Games. For those keeping score, this is the second game of this type I've covered, the first being The Last Sovereign, which is a convenient segue since Lord Forte cites The Last Sovereign as a major inspiration. The similarities are immediately apparent if you've played both: shared game design, overlapping themes, and even a few direct references buried in the text. That said, Noblesse Oblige isn't a carbon copy and has its own distinct voice, tone, and writing style. I'm a proponent of promoting lesser-known games that genuinely deserve more attention, and Noblesse Oblige certainly qualifies. I only discovered it because a viewer mentioned it in the comments of my Last Sovereign video, and I'm glad they did. It has its issues, the biggest one being that it's unfinished. But despite its flaws, I don't think any of them are deal breakers for fans of this genre. If you enjoy turn-based RPGs, epic fantasy, aristocratic politicking, and meaningful choice and consequence systems, you owe it to yourself to at least check it out. And I cannot stress this enough, the game is completely free, funded through Patreon. I'll keep spoilers to a minimum. The premise is straightforward. You play as Alexander, the young would-be prince and heir to a long line of sorcerer kings, powerful, magic-wielding warrior rulers who established a multi-generational dynastic kingdom in your traditional medieval fantasy world. Alexander begins the story away from home, studying at a prestigious magic academy where he learns swordplay, sorcery, and the finer points of noble etiquette. He's somewhat prideful and believes in his divine birthright to rule, but he also has a code of honor. He believes rulers have an obligation to protect and uphold the welfare of their subjects. In other words, Noblesse Oblige. We're quickly introduced to two other characters at the academy. First is Ariadne, a fire sorceress and Alexander's wife through a politically arranged marriage with a neighboring kingdom. They're fond of each other but not romantically involved at first, and maintain an open marriage so long as both parties remain discreet. The second is Ligaya, a nobleman's daughter and skilled archer. Alexander rescues her from being sexually accosted, and the two of them swiftly become romantically involved. One night at the academy, assassins attempt to murder Alexander in his bedroom. He survives and soon learns his father, the king, has been killed and his cousin has usurped the throne. And with that, the story begins. Gather allies, avenge your father, and reclaim your birthright. Before getting into the broader narratives and writing, let's talk about the opening and gameplay. Given how good the rest of the game is, it's a shame Noblesse Oblige has such a weak first impression. The title itself is somewhat generic and is written in ornate, hard-to-read font that would look more appropriate on a heavy metal album cover. The menu art is also inconsistent with the in-game portraits. Alexander in particular looks overly effeminate and gives off a completely different vibe than his in-game counterpart. After a brief text crawl introducing the setting, you're dropped into a combat encounter with little context and no proper tutorial. Thankfully, your party is vastly overpowered, so it's nearly impossible to lose. You then switch to Alexander at the Magic Academy and the game properly begins. The RPG Maker tilesets here are visually noisy and the map layout is confusing, with too many branching paths this early in the game. This is unfortunately a recurring issue in some of the game's large interior locations like castles and fortresses. You're also quickly given access to numerous lore books detailing the world's history, religions, and geography. While reading them is optional, it's far too much information to front-load. I skipped most of them initially, even though I later became genuinely interested in the setting. It's a disorienting start to an otherwise good game, though thankfully, this rough patch only lasts for the first 30 to 60 minutes or so. So let's talk about the first negative most people are going to be hesitant about: RPG Maker. Yes, the game uses familiar, often reused pixel art assets, especially noticeable if you've played other similar RPG Maker titles. Personally, this didn't bother me, and I think the game generally uses them well. Most towns and cities manage to feel distinct despite simple tile sets, and most major characters have unique portraits. While I understand some players prefer a more unique art style than what RPG Maker offers, I don't think it meaningfully detracts from the experience. Gameplay-wise, this is the standard turn-based RPG fare found in basically every game of its kind. You control a team of up to 5 party members, select attacks, spells, heal, buff and debuff, you know the drill. Characters level, you equip gear, stats go up. Do I really need to explain? If you've played a turn-based RPG before, there's nothing here you haven't seen. The game does attempt a unique mechanic by trying to simulate physical distance on the battlefield. The first example you're given is archers take less damage from close combat fighters, which is meant to represent archers being further away and thus harder to hit. In practice, this system matters less than it would seem and usually feels unintuitive since ranged fighters appear to be the same size and as close to you as everyone else. Thankfully, there's no grinding, no random encounters, no invisible enemies popping up out of nowhere. And like I said in my last Sovereign video, while I think the system is better overall, it has its downsides. But first, the positives. Encounters are designed with intent. Fights feel deliberate and are meant to teach you about the game's mechanics, character moves, and can be interesting challenges. They don't always succeed at that, and at times it can feel like there are too many fights in a row, but you're not endlessly grinding hundreds of trash mobs. The game always knows what the player's maximum potential strength is and can tailor challenges accordingly. What level your characters are, what equipment you own, and how much gold you've acquired are deliberately chosen. That said, the game provides side quests and other optional content which creates a strange tension. If you skip side content, you can unintentionally handicap yourself since all challenges are calibrated around the fact that you could have done them. In effect, optional content isn't really optional. Fortunately, most of the side content is good, but it's still an odd design choice. Two other gameplay issues stand out as introducing too much too fast and some frustrating boss fights. Party members tend to have more moves than they reasonably need, including when they're first introduced. Cynthia is the clearest example of this. She comes loaded with more moves than you can count on both hands, has offense and defense modes with unique abilities you can switch between mid-fight, attacks that generate or spend fury points, and combo chains. It's a lot to absorb, especially when you're first introduced to her, and this kind of design holds true for multiple characters. Movesets only become more complex as new chapters introduce more moves. In my playthrough, I relied on the same handful of moves for most encounters and only experimented if I hit a wall. And occasionally, those walls are boss fights that cross from challenging to aggravating. They can be unreasonably difficult, although difficult might not be the right word. Difficult implies there's some kind of challenge to overcome or puzzle to solve rather than what these fights are, a test of the player's patience. You'll be retrying these fights over and over, especially considering combat includes RNG. A boss might KO multiple party members in the same round, or take out the only party member who can revive other characters, after which you may as well just restart the fight. I got stuck on certain boss fights for upwards of 2 hours. Fortunately, these moments are the exception rather than the rule. Because the game is so dense, it can be hard to keep track of everything. Quests, abilities, forging new weapons, political decisions. The game keeps a record of most important information, but it's still a lot to remember even when you play chapters back to back, never mind if you're picking the game up again after months between chapters. But ultimately, you're not here for the gameplay, you're here for the story, which is where Noblesse Oblige shines. I think this game is worth experiencing yourself, so I'll do my best to limit spoilers. The narrative centers on Alexander and his campaign to reclaim the throne, gather allies, form an army, and avenge the death of his father, but it soon branches out into many different interconnected storylines. The plot is definitely vast in scope, sometimes to its detriment as there's simply not enough time to cover everything each chapter. Still, the ideas being explored are consistently interesting. There's a lot of political maneuvering, warfare and battle tactics, philosophizing on the nature of leadership, discussions about economic policy, the duties of nobility, what's expected of and owed to the people, religious institutions, and so on. Characters are intelligent, offer well-reasoned arguments, and ask you to consider positions from multiple different angles and worldviews. Party members regularly disagree with each other while still having understandable reasons for their opinions, and it's up to you to decide which decisions are best. The choice and consequence system is particularly strong once you establish a base of operations. You allocate resources, form alliances, invest in infrastructure, and make long-term strategic plans. These choices have real consequences. You will lock off some paths while opening others. Allying yourself with one faction can alienate another. You can even lose main party members. Unlike The Last Sovereign, where choices and consequences often felt opaque and almost required a guide, Noblesse Oblige is much clearer. You generally understand what you're choosing, the costs involved, why it matters, and what the risks and possible outcomes are. I never felt compelled to reload saves or seek online help. In fact, the game actively discourages save scumming by delaying consequences until long after you've set the ball rolling. Payoffs are often not realized until one or more chapters later. There's an enormous cast of characters with a giant web of relationships between them, but the core revolves around Alexander and the two love interests, Ariadne and Ligaia, who eventually form a tripartite relationship. It sounds salacious, and to some extent it is, but there's genuine emotional substance behind it. There are hints at other potential love interests, but the main relationship is between those three. The game has a solid grasp of tone and mood setting, with some scenes being genuinely moving. My personal favorite involves Alexander dancing with Ariadne at her father's banquet. Her fire sorcery, long treated as an unseemly curse, is woven into a magical performance alongside Alexander's wind and rain. It's a beautiful, character-defining moment that even the political enemies in attendance acknowledge. The music, while composed of royalty-free tracks, is used effectively and feels cohesive. Battles feel tense, emotional moments land. In fact, all the background music you're hearing in this video comes from the game. Morality isn't simple. Conflicts often require uncomfortable compromises, and sometimes there isn't a clean solution. Stopping one enemy often involves allying with another. Sometimes there's no perfect choice, and you have to choose the best trade-off. Antipater, the usurping cousin, initially appears to be a straightforward villain, an opportunist who betrayed the king. But he's also a respected war hero, and while not as cunning as Alexander, he's not an idiot puppet king or uncaring ruler. He's also not the sole antagonist, as there are multiple factions ruled by different adversaries. The game also presents a number of ongoing, engaging mysteries, the most notable being the question of who killed the king and why, as there are many potential culprits. Aside from the overall plot and themes, the moment-to-moment dialogue is generally quite good. Characters speak eloquently and appropriately for their noble station, mostly avoiding modern-day colloquialisms. That said, you better love reading, as there's a lot of it, sometimes too much. Characters can be overly verbose, with some scenes feeling overwritten, padded, or repetitive. The game could have definitely benefited from another editing pass, with the occasional text box overflowing for a single word. Even as someone who enjoys dense epic fantasy and reads quickly, it can be mentally draining, to the point where I often needed to take breaks. Every NPC updates their dialogue after major story beats, which is impressive at first until the sheer volume becomes overwhelming. The cast keeps expanding to the point where, in later chapters, there are so many NPCs that I had to stop myself speaking to every stray foot soldier and maid so as not to become exhausted. I'm not exaggerating when I say it can take up to an hour if you're determined to speak to everyone. There's also a particular conversational pattern that, as the chapters progressed, really started to grate on my nerves. It goes like this. Alexander speaks to someone of lower status. They don't recognize him and are rude. Alexander reveals who he is. The other person nervously apologizes. Alexander forgives them, demonstrating his magnanimity. This conversation happens in literally every chapter, sometimes multiple times, and eventually became eye-roll inducing. As the narrative expands and becomes more complex, it becomes overly plot-focused and character development suffers. Characters get lost in the shuffle, with little to no development or screen time. For example, the Moon Sorceress and major party member Calicia feels underdeveloped, and Ariadne and Ligaia's arc seem to stall out. Finally, the game includes optional text-only adult scenes. This decision seems to have been initially inspired by The Last Sovereign, as it's an adult game, but later it was phased out of the base game and now requires you to download a patch. I'd love to describe them to you, but the patch didn't work for me. It's obvious where these scenes are supposed to go, and they're not that common. The PG-13 preambles to them are written well enough and in the style of traditional romance novels, which I imagine would appeal more to female gamers. I don't feel their absence detracted from the experience, although obviously I can't say for sure since I didn't read them. My biggest hesitation with recommending Noblesse Oblige wasn't RPG Maker or turn-based combat or any of the other flaws I outlined. It's that the game is unfinished. As of this video, there are 16 chapters, released episodically, months apart. The story is massive, and judging by where the plot is as of the latest chapter and its likely trajectory, I don't think it's anywhere near completion. I'm not even sure it's halfway done. There's always the risk with unfinished games that the developer could abandon the project for various reasons like health problems, burnout, or career pressures. There's precedent already, as Lord Forte has previously taken a multi-year hiatus. With that said, the existing content is substantial. Chapters typically run 4 to 6 hours if you engage with the side content, which you can see on my no commentary playthrough, link in the description. At 16 chapters at the time of this video, that's quite a lot. Still, having a proper ending matters a lot to the overall experience, for me and many others. So while I do recommend Noblesse Oblige, that recommendation is conditioned on the game eventually being finished. If you're watching this in the future and it's become clear the developer pulled a George R.R. Martin, I'd rescind my recommendation. What Lord Forte has created here is genuinely impressive, especially for a solo developer, and I hope he sees it through to the end. I'm looking forward to it.